Welcome everyone to another one of the Association for the Study of the Cuban Economy's interviews. For those of you, as a short reminder, the Association for the Study of the Cuban Economy has been hosting a series of interviews with some fabulously interesting people who are at the forefront of the study of Cuban economy, society, culture, and the like. And I am delighted to be able to host this with a group of very interesting people. Today, we have a very special treat, a really special treat, and I am just delighted that I was finally able to snag him. We have Luis, who is an international economist in Massachusetts, specializing in international finance and investment. Just critically important areas right now. He's a co-founder of International Research and Strategy, a firm centered on emerging markets and finance. Previously, he was managing director at Scudder Investments in Boston, directing international research and helping to manage international fixed income and equity portfolio. And for those of you who don't understand how that makes the world go round, pay attention. This is, critically interesting and important work within the context of globalization and its structures. He was the director of the Latin American department at the Institute of International Finance in Washington. He also served as head of international economics at Midland Bank in London and Crocker Bank in San Francisco, and was chief economist at the OAS in Washington. I bow to you. It was excellent. He was in the economics faculty at the US Naval Academy in Annapolis and American University, and has held a Fulbright visiting professorship at the University of Trujillo in Peru. He's lectured on international economics at universities in several South American and European countries, is the author of articles on international finance and on the Cuban economy, and a contributor to several books on emerging markets and portfolio management. He holds a PhD degree in economics from the University of Notre Dame, and he's been a member of ASCE since its foundation. And for that, I am eternally grateful for your work in both organizing and for being one of the pillars on which this organization rests. So welcome, and thank you so much. I wanted to start off with the question I usually start the interviews. Just tell us a little bit about yourself and how you got here from there. And there is, of course, the motherland. And here is where we are now.
Well, thank you, Larry, for organizing these sessions. Hopefully they'll be of interest. And thank you also for raising the topics that we are going to be dealing with today that are very timely. And I don't really have much to say about myself. I actually was born in the US and I went to Cuba when I was very, very small to live with my mother's family, and then came back to the US and went to school in the US, finished high school and went to university, and became an economist. And I have alternated in my career between being an academic more in my earlier period, and then being involved with either policymaking or commercial businesses that are involved in international finance and investments. So I try to keep both playing around at the same time. And I have been in Boston now for the last 28 years, involved in both doing research and also being practically involved with mostly emerging markets, but also international economics in a broad sense. And I've always kept an interest in Cuba. So we joined the association, ASCE, when it was set up. And I actually remember presenting a paper at the first session of ASCE in, I think, must have been 1991, and I tried to keep up with it. It's an association that keeps intellectual ferment about not only the Cuban economy but Cuban institutions, Cuban society in general, in a broad sense. And that's it. I like to write about the Cuban economy and do that continuously as much as I can.
Excellent, excellent. Well, then it's time. like the and in a way, you're going to be my my head of the Central Yorua in Havana, and we're going to prognosticate. We're not going to do any fa divination, but we're gonna do something very similar. So I wanted to start with a prognostication, and that is, we know that January 1st is coming, and there's going to be a number of economic changes. So I was wondering if you can tell us a little bit about the new economic policy changes that are going to be implemented in the next less than a week, and your sense of what they are and what they portend.
As we all know, on January 1st, Cuba will have a monetary bang, a monetary big bang. And this is the central measure. It involves fusing two currencies and also at the same time doing a devaluation of the surviving currency, which would be the Cuban peso. So the two existing currencies, the so-called Cook convertible peso and the Cuban peso, will essentially be merging. And at the same time, we will have a change in the exchange rate of the Cuban peso from 1 to $1 to 1 to 24 pesos to $1. So alongside with this, there are a huge number of measures the government is undertaking. They call them normas in Cuba. This means legal decrees or legal ordinances that are going to be placed and essentially to manage in the government sense what this process of a transition to a new currency at a much lower exchange rate will be. Now, this is a huge change because the average change in my calculations is about 6 to 1. In other words, if you get the accounting average of transactions in Cuba to the new average on January 1st, this will be a jump of 1 to 6 times. And this is huge. In the history of devaluations, you talk about big devaluations when they are 10%, 15, 20%. This is essentially 600%. And what this means is that there'll be a lot of dislocation from it. In order to try to manage this, the government has published lists of many basic prices and services that are going to be fixed after the devaluation at the new currency. But the question is, okay, so that the reason the devaluation was done and the unification is because there are huge distortions. This is a very distorted economy, and people and firms could not really use prices as a guide for investing or allocating production and resources. So now they are in a new system, but this new system will also have fixed prices. Now, this by itself will create a whole set of new distortions because, when you have this magnitude of change, 6 to 1, then you essentially change all prices and then fix them. And this is a very difficult thing, but also it doesn't portend it will be an easy task at all to make this work over time. But this is one question.
Can I ask you a question?
Yes.
And again, I'm not an economist, so
yes.
Feel free to laugh when I ask really dumb questions. So here's my really dumb question. So we're going to have a 600% devaluation. At the same time, you've got a government that does not believe in the market. Devaluations work if the market then corrects. And so at the same time that they're going to devalue, you're telling me that they're going to set prices. And they're going to set prices by reference to what they need to get. But if they effectively set prices, are you effectively undermining the devaluation? Well, one of two things. You're either undermining the devaluation because by setting prices, you've negated the whole point of the devaluation in the first place because you've kind of ratcheted everything back up artificially. Or secondly, what you've done is you've created two economic systems, the official system where all these prices are set, and then everything around it. And if that's the case, is that going to be worse than what they have now?
Well, I mean, what they did had to be done because the distortion was huge, and it didn't make any sense. Usually having two currencies is a very bad idea. So having said this, it had to be done, but it is very difficult and costly to do it right, in the sense that it has side effects. And but if one fixes prices, as you say, then the markets will not clear. It's highly unlikely the markets will clear, because there are dozens of prices that they have set, actually hundreds of prices and services. And it's highly unlikely they'll be clearing prices. In other words, prices where supply and demand equal to each other. So essentially, it's going to create essentially a dislocation again. Now, the reason they're doing this, and let's get the reason why they're doing it, is because the devaluation will have inflationary consequences, and by setting prices, they will presumably protect the purchasing power of the mass of the people by setting control prices. Now, there are some free prices in Cuba, and they're talking about that there will be limits on these prices. In other words, if you have cuenta propistas, which are entrepreneurs that have small businesses, and then they set free prices, the government is saying, well, if they are excessive, we will control them. There'll be a limit, but again, that will create shortages. But they're trying to essentially they're trying to limit the inflationary consequences. And the reason these are important is because Cuba imports about half the food it consumes, and this will be affected directly by the devaluation. And they're trying to essentially have moderation on food prices and controlling them. But the problem is that these controls will be a disincentive for domestic production, and farmers in Cuba, independent farmers, will now still have also fixed prices. And essentially, this will be a disincentive to increase food production in Cuba. So so one side, they're trying to control inflation. On the other one, there'll be the negative consequences on production, and essentially there'll be black market prices. It's what happens, and the black market prices are also going to be hit by the fact the country has a severe dollar shortage. So there's a scarcity of imported foodstuffs, and the scarcity will mean that prices in the free markets will exceed quite a bit the control prices.
Okay, and so at the end of the day, though, then what has Cuba gotten other than to officially eliminate the dual currency? Because the effect seems to be we're going to have one currency now, but we're going to have multiple spaces where things will work or not work. And in a sense, so I guess the question I have is, ultimately, is this going to be more form than function? That it's a gesture that makes everyone happy because at least now we have one currency, but the effect, the full effect of moving to one currency and moving to a currency that then will be used to efficiently allocate, using pricing and demand mechanisms to effectively allocate resources, will be the same as it was when there were two currencies or 200 currencies.
Exactly. The problem is they're doing a big monetary bank. There'll be a big devaluation, and there'll be a big expansion of the money supply, because the new price levels caused by the devaluation need to be financed. Why? Because the government will be subsidizing companies and consumers, and that needs to be financed by money expansion, essentially, so that there's a bang. But there's been no bang, no important change in freeing the economy from the constraints of a controlled system. In other words, the difference is that for instance, the former Soviet states, they had been monetary reforms, which is what the Cubans are doing, but also there have been sustain reform of the price system, of the enterprise system at the same time. And here, that's not happening. The reform is, ordenamiento is not a bad word, because they're trying to get a single currency and then have a single exchange rate. But it needs to go well beyond that. And slowly they are discovering that they probably have to do that. And they're doing very small steps, like they say they're privatizing restaurants, and they are going to allow more licensing. Now is easier for self-employed people. They can, they got rid of a list they had.
Right.
Naming all the occupations, and now this list doesn't exist. So theoretically, more people, including professionals that were not allowed to set up their own enterprises, could theoretically be allowed. But all this is very gradual, very small steps. And meanwhile, they have to deal with all the new distortions. And the new distortions will be tough. Particularly because when countries do this kind of thing, they usually have the IMF, let's say, and the World Bank and international agencies and all other countries lending them money to be able to have a cushion. And this cushion could be used, for example, to manage the exchange rate. So they could free the exchange rate. The exchange rate is going to be fixed. And then essentially help manage it to have a stable system that is competitive. Cuba doesn't have this foreign support at this stage. And it's very difficult to then have the right exchange rate policy without the support. Now, it still could be done, but they haven't chosen not to do it. For instance,
yeah. But let me ask you a question, though. And again, I'm playing devil's advocate from a complete position of ignorance, so feel free to laugh. So I'm thinking, well, the one thing Cuba does have is a huge amount of debt. And there's two ways of getting money, I suppose. One of them is to actually get a loan, and the other one is to not pay off the loans you've already gotten. So might Cuba be able to cushion, not by getting loans, but effectively going back to the Paris Club and saying, hey, baby, I'm not going to pay. Look what we've done. We've been a good boy. We now have a single currency instead of a double currency. So you're just going to have to lay off and renegotiate or refinance or forgive the debt.
Well, Cuba is an expert in borrowing by not paying. In other words, so what they've done for decades is not pay interest and principal on their debts, and that is a loan. In other words, these are obligations they're supposed to pay, and they don't pay them. So they're getting these loans all the time. It's nothing new. And they've exhausted this because they actually are not paying very much. And the Paris Club is only one small part of the whole thing. The big problem is that the critical funding is for suppliers, people who supply parts and equipment and some foodstuffs. And these people, Cuba pays them selectively. In other words, ones that are critical, like really basic foodstuffs, then they pay those suppliers, and they don't pay the ones that are less critical. There is a float of unpaid debt to the suppliers, and the Cubans haven't published a number for a number of years, but it's a large number. It's larger than the Paris Club obligations.
Wow.
And it's critical. And essentially, yeah, they do that by paying in a staggered basis, the ones that they need to import. They buy rice from Thailand, then they pay the Thai company that ships Thai rice to Cuba. But so they do that. It's a way of managing it. But that's reached its limit because they already are essentially in default, most of it. And yeah, I mean, that they're getting a loan in the sense that there is interest on interest, is penalty clauses in loan agreements and so forth. So yes, they use that, but they are in critical need of funding for all kinds of things. People don't realize, for example, that direct investment largely takes place in the form of loans, not direct investment. And this is closed. In other words, that's why I don't get much direct investment, because the credit worthiness of Cuba is very low. So it's very difficult even for foreign companies to get a loan to invest in Cuba and finance their capital.
Okay, but do the foreign companies? All right, so I'm thinking about the way you subsidize directly or indirectly. Yeah. If I'm a foreign company and I know that Cuba has done this for 70 years, and I'm still going off and effectively lending them money by allowing them to buy on credit, I'm either an idiot because I know that they've got a 70-year track record, or I'm either getting insurance or a subsidy or a guarantee from my own home state. Yes. If it's door number two, then isn't that another perhaps indirect way of loaning? Again, not government to government, but government through private to government, so that effectively you're getting some kind of subsidy for that as well. Businesses are more than happy to do this when from time to time they can go back to their insurers or to the guarantees of whatever Ex-Im bank they have and get some money so that they can continue doing this.
They do, and this is the importance of the Paris Club, that when the it's not only the direct lending, but the fact that that agencies such as COFAS in France, and every country has its export finance agency, can also insure operations as well as do some lending. And so when you have regularized the Paris Club relations in 2008, 2016, then some of these open up, but it was not very large. Because these agencies also have limits, and they also know that there's a risk involved, and so it does provide some financing, but it's not huge. Now we don't know about the Chinese in great detail. The Chinese have, but we do know that the Chinese have tightened up their lending, and China has been in the last 5 years, the last 10 years, the most important bilateral lender to Cuba, doing financing through the Export-Import Bank and the Development Bank and so forth, and supplier credits. We don't know the exact numbers. We know that they've been restructuring some of it, but they've tightened that up about 3 years ago. By 2019, they were quite tighter. That's why Chinese exports to Cuba really went down in 2019. And the reason is that the credit was cut off, because in many ways the Chinese system is decentralized, and private and state companies are not going to lend if they have a low probability of being repaid. But again, what happens there is that the ones that are higher priority get paid, and the ones that are not don't. But there are big arrears between Cuba and China, which we don't know the exact number.
Right. Yeah, and Chinese industries, have to report higher up, and there'll be no excuses unless there's a policy from the central authorities to allow things to go. They're not going to be willing to take the chance. Yeah, no, I agree about that. So let me ask you a different set of questions. So we've been talking about mechanics, and we've been talking about sort of underlying normative basis for this, but what specifically, and you know that the Cubans have objectives. I mean, we've talked about a few of them, but I'm really curious about the kind of universe of objectives that the Cuban government has in doing this and doing this now. Micro objectives, macro objectives, and do they make sense given what they are attempting to do?
Well, they know they needed to reform the system, and one key reason is that the system involves huge subsidies. The old system involved huge subsidies to companies that were getting a preferential exchange rate. Some were getting 1-to-1. They could import at 1 peso per $1. Others were 10-to-1, depending. They actually had created a multiple exchange rate system, which involves these huge subsidies. So that, of course, hit the budget, and estimates are that in 2020, the budget deficit will be higher than 15% of GDP.
Wow.
And some estimates are even quite a bit higher than that. So essentially, the system involves huge subsidies of inefficient enterprises and also subsidies to keep employment high. And what their aim is to increase the efficiency of these companies and get rid of the subsidies. Now, their own plans indicate that for 2021, there'll be a reduction of subsidies, but not an elimination of subsidies. That when you calculate the price increases that they've listed for state companies and services have been higher than the ones implied by this trade devaluation. So that essentially means that there'll be a need for fewer subsidies in 2020 is what their plans is. So it's kind of a gradual approach. They're going to decrease the amount of subsidy, but they already published the numbers of the government deficit planned for 2021, and that is it's like 87 billion new pesos, if you want. And that's quite a bit. It's a very large deficit, and it will imply essentially expansion of financing by printing money. And it means that there'll be inflationary pressures in the entire system. But they're trying to reduce the subsidies, so their aim is to do this. But the problem is that if they reduce subsidies and companies eventually have to shrink or disappear, state companies that are unprofitable, then there'll be unemployment will go up, and that's the second consequence. So in order for this to not be a problem, they need to be absorbed by private firms, by essentially the private economy, because the state economy will be shrinking.
But wait a minute. That would be, and I'm going to play devil's advocate, because I'm sitting here and I'm in a very nice office in Havana, and I'm thinking, well, okay, classical economists and classical economics would move me in that direction, that if the subsidies go and this thing is just inefficient, it's going to have to go private. But then I'm thinking, well, but we're not in a classical economy. What if instead of going private, what I can do is transfer the subsidies from the state, from the Cuban state, to outside investors, so that what I can do is perhaps get the Spanish or get the French or get the Canadians to invest in these companies and then give them effectively some managerial leeway to make these things efficient, but at their expense. So that effectively I can avoid privatizing these companies by infusing them with foreign money, especially since with most of these companies kind of are insulated in terms of their investment from the core of the internal economy, and they tend to look out. Is that an insane idea?
Well, I mean, I find it difficult to do that. I think the constraint on them is that they cannot let these state companies disappear without creating an employment problem. So, but the answer is that they have to provide the incentives for the private sector in general, the private activities to grow faster and then begin absorbing some of this excess labor force. Now, what about foreign investors? Well, I mean, foreign investors, Cuba is a tough place for foreign investors because the risk is very high. And I tell everyone, okay, if you're an investor and want to invest in Cuba, what kind of return do you need to get? And it's very high because there's a risk your dividends will be frozen, that you cannot ship capital out, you cannot have flexibility to set prices. So it's a very difficult environment to operate. So I think at this stage, they need to do a lot more change to get foreign companies. I don't think that foreign companies are terribly interested in buying most state companies in Cuba that are very inefficient. They're typically interested in things like utilities, which are less complex management problem. But I don't think Cuba is about to do anything in that sector that would be considered sort of strategic sector like utilities or a telephone company and so forth. But yeah. And the others, well, there's a whole array of very inefficient companies and that are really with the devaluation, maybe in worse financial shape. So the question is, will these subsidies really decline significantly or not? And I mean, they're likely to go down to some extent, but again, it would not be enough to have the kind of control on the budget that they need to get a stable environment. I think that the 2021 government deficit will be quite high, certainly over 10% of GDP.
Okay. Okay. How does this affect, by the way, was there any consideration as they went through this with the effects of this on the much ballyhooed 2030 economic plan? You remember that?
Oh, yes. Well, no, I think I mean, planning is not a bad thing if you leave enough variables that can adjust themselves. And, you know, one has to make investment plans, and that there's nothing wrong with that. But the question is that in Cuba, they believe they still need to have very detailed plans that get involved with all kinds of micromanagement of state firms and consumer prices and so forth. And this is not consistent with making this monetary bank they're undertaking, which will be costly, work well. And but I think, I mean, obviously it's a debate within the Cuban government about what to do. And I'm not an expert in this, but obviously there's a big discussions and they're trying to figure out what is the best way forward. Some people speak that there is some glasnost going on in Cuba now, but I'm not being there, I can't really have a precise judgment on this. But yeah, there is a thought that at least market mechanisms will be used more than they have in the past. And I don't think they're at the point where they're going to have the kind of very broad liberalization that took place in Eastern Europe after the Soviet collapse. That they are not contemplating that, and I think politically it's not clear they can do that. But what they need to do is essentially liberalize the price system and create not fair markets. And they are now allowing some markets to operate, but again, they are trying to set limits to how much they can operate. And I mean, if the costs are going up because of the devaluation, then you can't really set a limit. Otherwise, you will shut down production.
Right. And for me, that's very interesting, because a lot, when I hear this, especially when I see the Cuban moves as you've described them, what I'm seeing is a zero sum. And let me be devil's advocate for a second again. The Cuban government over the last 30 years or so has become really good at raising hopes for moving the economic model closer to even a socialist, a Marxist socialist markets model, right? And at the same time, by completely undermining it, either by the procedures that they put in or by absolutely refusing to change the fundamental principle that markets are fundamentally evil bourgeois capitalist instruments of the imperio, and that therefore they must be controlled. And when you put the two of them together, you get a bunch of people, especially on the outside, and some reformers on the inside being hope, 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 hope. You see the realities grinding, right, in the details and in the refusal of the Communist Party to change the fundamental principles of the economic model. And then ultimately this thing, it'll run a year, it'll run 2 years, and then we're back where we were. Do you have a sense that this may be the way this is going to play out as well, except at the end we'll have one currency instead of two?
Well, you know, this is just the beginning. In other words, this was this monetary bank was something that needed to be done. It's a step one, and it's just by itself, it's a correction. It's actually, devaluations are usually not called reforms because devaluations are usually forced by a crisis in the balance of payments, which means a foreign exchange crisis. That's why big devaluations take place. And this one, there's been a crisis in Cuba on the balance of payments for many, many years, but it's been suppressed. You know, they were not suppressed in terms of scarcity, because that's quite clear. The consequences being scarcity, but suppressed in terms of markets don't shoot up because they're repressed. In other words, interest rates don't shoot up because they're fixed. In a typical balance of payments crisis, you can see this in markets. So what they've done is do that correction, and then not do very much fundamental change after that. And why? Well, yes, I think there is a distrust of markets, that markets are some kind of plot that essentially are anti-socialist and so forth. And why I'm not a political scientist, and I don't really understand all the arguments, but it is a fact that there's a distrust. And but you know, I tell people that individuals, they actually are rational, and they behave as if markets existed.
Yeah.
And when there is scarcity, they bid prices up. And the same for the currency. They set up the currency at 24, but we know in the black market, the last quotes that I've seen range between 30 and 45 pesos per dollar.
Wow.
And so essentially, people are rational. In other words, they expect this exchange rate, given what they know, will be higher, and be much higher, because you know they know there'll be subsidies. The government will be expanding money, and dollars are needed to buy in special dollar stores. So they behave as if this dollar was going to increase in price. And you cannot suppress that, because that's the way that people react logically. And so it has to be taken into account, because as long as these expectations are like that, you cannot really stabilize the country. You know, in order to develop, we will learn over many, many years in developing countries that you have to have a stable environment. And in order to have a stable environment, I'm talking about a stable economic and political environment. In order to do that, you need to have the right policies. And the way that things are going now, we are not seeing that taking place. There will not be a stable economic environment, and therefore will be a difficult environment to invest, even for state firms. I mean, state firms should be also market-oriented firms. It doesn't impede. There'll be a state sector in Cuba, probably be a large state sector, but this sector should be competitive and also obey market signals and participate in the market and compete. But the way it's structured now, the state firms are quasi-monopolies or oligopolies that are not in a, even if they were more efficient, they're not ready to be competitive.
Yeah, no, that's right. So let me play devil's advocate again. This is my and it's fun not being an economist, because I can say all kinds of crazy stuff, and you can laugh and use it as a teaching moment. So here's my crazy idea of the day. The next crazy idea of the day. All right. So as a devil's advocate, I'm going to say, well, look, I've looked at this monetary reform, right? El ordenamiento monetario, but I've also looked at it in the context in which it's actually going to operate. And I would posit the following. There is no monetary unification except in form, and that at the end of the day, what you're going to have is one formal currency, but three currencies in operation in Cuba. And the three currencies are as follows. You'd have the dollar, and dollar currencies as a subtextual currency as part of the economy. You'll have the internal peso, which operates in accordance with all of these rules. And then because Cuba has effectively bifurcated its economy, it has created this wall between its dealings outside and then its dealings within the country. You've got the Mariel district, you've got all of that stuff, so that Cuba remains insulated, that the currency effectively, in terms of rates of exchange, that is going to be used by Cuba in its outward dealings is going to have very little relationship to the currency that Cuba is going to permit to circulate and to act in its internal operations, so that at the end of the day, what you have is three currencies in Cuba, and they're going to have a hell of a time regulating all three of them, or they're going to manage them the way you manage factions to keep everyone either off their game or controllable. So that's my crazy idea.
Well, no, I think there'll be two currencies, and but the peso will be non-convertible and will not trade outside of Cuba. And although it may trade, I mean, at some point there'll be a black market or a market for Cuban pesos. Citibank is famous for making markets in all kinds of obscure currencies. And at some point that may happen. And then it'll be the dollar. So the interesting thing about the dollar is that people don't realize is that there's talk about Cuba become dollarized because they have to use dollars for transactions in special stores. And then there's a market for markets in Cuba that the dollar utilizes the dollar. So you can buy houses with dollars, this kind of thing, and cars and so forth, you know, and there's always a parallel market like that. But the interesting thing that people don't realize is there are fewer dollars in Cuba. And the reason there are fewer dollars is because tourism has been cut off, and essentially remittances probably have gone down some. The flow of dollars to Cuba has declined quite a bit, particularly in the last 10 months, but before too. So they're dollarizing the economy with fewer dollars, and this is a paradox that people don't see. But in terms of the value of the dollar in pesos, that may have gone up. We don't know for sure because the dollar keeps going up in price. So you have this is the dollarization, fewer dollars, but probably a higher value in domestic currency of the dollar stock in Cuba. But it's an interesting phenomenon, and it's not, people imagine dollarization means a dollar is going to be widespread, but it's not. I mean, the dollar scarcity is worse, and but it's the valve and the currency for high value transactions and a store of value. You know, the dollar is the way you save in Cuba because people realize that pesos are going to be devalued more.
Right. But would it make sense then for the Cubans to deal with their external economic relations in dollars then rather than in pesos, and let the peso do whatever it wants internally?
Well, I mean, the peso cannot be used because it's non-convertible, it's not accepted. And, I mean, Cuba cannot really do anything. I mean, when countries become solvent, one of the key elements is that they can borrow in their own currency. Like in Brazil, they can issue real bonds, and then Germans can invest in real bonds, and the Brazilians borrow in their own currency. That's a huge advantage. Cuba is, I mean, it's very, very far from being able to do anything like this. And so that the peso is really not an operating currency outside of Cuba. And there had to be a huge change in the creditworthiness of Cuba, which is not in the cards. They have to settle all their debts and regularize them and restructure them, so forth, you know, and it's going to take a while to do that and get the, I mean, something magic would have to happen. They have to have a revamp of of expectations in Cuba so that they get a flow of foreign money, foreign capital in. And you know, it isn't about to happen. The foreign investment is not a problem of the laws. The laws in Cuba are reasonable, the foreign investment laws. The problem is the operating environment. Is a very high risk operating environment. And it's a function of the fact that the currency is not convertible, that essentially there are many problems with the way businesses are managed or can be managed. So they're not about to get a huge flow of money that will enable them to get back to a normal relationship with the outside world, a normal financial relationship.
All right. So okay. So yeah, effectively, it's almost checkmate, and I think I better understand the point that you've been making throughout our discussion in terms of what it really means that this is a first step rather than a middle or end step. All this does is position Cuba to begin doing the things that over the course of, it sounds like, a number of years, assuming that they have the will to stay the course, will have to be done in order for them to be better integrated both internally and externally in terms of the relationship of their currency, their economy, and then their relationships inside and outside.
Yes, I mean, they're beginning a process. It's interesting that it is a beginning, and they're realizing that further steps have to be made. And they've done as I said, the first steps. You know, they're opening up the list of people who can set up businesses, but still have a long way to go. There's no incorporation of private businesses, no legal status for private businesses. Right. There is a whole array of elementary steps that they have to undertake. And,
right. A lot of those have been on the to-do list since lineamientos. I recall they were going to revamp their codes. They're going to revamp their contracts, laws, et cetera, and it's been, 12 years.
Yes,
and that is still, and that's what gives me pause. And so if we got first steps and we're doing this slowly and rationally, the habits of the current government has been to treat first steps as last steps, at least until they need to take another step and they're forced to take another step by circumstances beyond their control.
Well, yeah, I think that the Cuban government, which, you know, comprises a diversity of people and opinions, you know, but the balance is a risk-avoiding group. You get a risk-avoiding result, so that they don't really want to take any significant risk. Although they're taking a big one now in their view, because they are dislocating the economy, they know that. But trying to do a controlled big bang, if it were, which is not possible. In other words, if you control the monetary bang too much, then you don't get the beneficial impacts and create further problems. So big banks have to be done with a lot of flexibility. And this hasn't been done. In other words, they're trying to reform significantly, but one can see the reason is that they have a financially unsustainable subsidy system that they are trying to reform, alongside these price dislocations. In other words, the fact that one company imports at 1 peso to $1, and another one at 10 to 1, and so forth. You know, in Mariel is 10 to 1. So this creates all kinds of huge disincentives and inefficiencies as to production and so forth. You know, that they're trying to get rid of. So it is a necessary step, but the following steps have not been made, only to a very limited degree. So. I mean, there are certain things that could have been done that are not too complicated. For instance, a lot of very poor countries, like one example is Burma, what is it called now, Myanmar,
Myanmar.
So Myanmar had a big devaluation once, and they set up very controlled auctions of foreign exchange by the central bank of Myanmar. And this auction system, which has been done in a number of countries, work well when you have a limited supply of dollars. Then you can set up a system whereby you make everyone bid in a controlled auction, and that includes state firms and private firms and so forth. But that's a much better system than the one they have set up, which is to fix the peso rate at 24. In this way, all you do is that if people really need dollars, they have to go to the black market, which overshoots. So if you have to buy 40 to 1, then that is an overshooting. It would not be as inefficient if you had auctions, let's say, use the market in a controlled way. And I think this is well known that this is one way that you can operate if you don't have a lot of money flowing in to support you from the IMF or the or agencies or friendly countries. Then you have to manage your scarce resources in an intelligent way. But they're risk avoiders, so that I think it was very difficult for them to do this. And they've been postponing it for so many years because there's been a lot of opposition. And finally, they did it at a time when it wasn't the best time, in the sense that the economy is now at a very terrible choke point of dollar scarcity. So but usually that's what happens. In other words, big devaluations take place when you have a crisis, a foreign exchange crisis, and because they're running way out of it. They've not paid suppliers, for instance, and they have these huge debts. And you can see their imports are down 45%, as far as we can tell, in the first half of the year. Just before the pandemic was down 45%. And this is what it is the constraint. You can look, imports are a very good indicator because these are all necessary imports. And when they are down 45%, that's the constraint they're hitting. And so they're doing this when their constraint was really biting, which is often what happens. Except that other places have more mechanisms in place to take advantages. The theory of the devaluation is that you get the real exchange rate down, the worst exchange rate adjusted for prices. And then that incentivizes exports and substitution of imports. So Cuba is not able to do this because production is very rigid. Exporters are, in economic terms, the answer is that Cuba has very inelastic supply of exports and inelastic demand for imports. And in order for devaluations to improve the foreign exchange crisis, you need to have fairly elastic export supplies and fairly elastic imports, so that as imports become more expensive, you import less. But the imports Cuba makes is foodstuffs and medicines. They're highly inelastic. You need to buy enough to feed people. You can't really contract that. So they are in a very difficult position to make gains from a devaluation, in the sense that they don't have the elasticity, if you want, the flexibility of supply. And on both sides, you have to have some response. And but you cannot change that. This is not a short-term problem. It's a longer-term problem.
Yeah. Right. And of course, you cannot talk about this problem, this being Cuba, right? You cannot talk about this problem without talking about the United States and without talking about sanctions. And so as a sort of follow-up questions, I've got two of them for you. The first is to have you put on your wizard's hat and to make a guess. Is the probability of success, given good intentions on the Cuban side, made easier or harder as a result of the November American election? That is, Is this going to, does it have a greater shot under a Biden administration than under a Trump administration, or is it irrelevant?
No, it is important. I mean, the sanctions hit Cuba, and I mean, it's difficult to refine the precise number, but they hit tourism by curtailing flights and cruise ships and making it more difficult for non-Cuban Americans to go to Cuba and so forth. You know, but estimates that have made by others are in the order of 20 to 30% impact on tourism. But what happened is the pandemic came. These things were announced in November, in October, November, when they tightened up remittances. And the ones on cruise ships were earlier. But what happened is that these measures also took place when the pandemic hit. And the pandemic took over. In other words, they stopped tourism in its tracks. So yes, I mean, the sanctions, when the country is in such dire straits, then it does have an impact, particularly on tourism. And the amounts are important, but they are much less important than the collapse of Venezuela, for instance, which was providing, Venezuela had deficits to Cuba for the last 4 years, the last 5 years, averaging something like between $5 and $6 billion per year. You know, Cuba had a trade surplus with Venezuela, and the Venezuelans were less and less able to pay that. The sanctions may have, and I really haven't done precise numbers on it, but it is in the order of a fraction of that, of 10-15% of the Venezuelan hit over time, maybe a little bit more. So yeah, when you are in a tough situation, this is a problem. Now, so there's the expectation that some of these sanctions on tourism will be lifted, and the remittance sanctions, I don't think that hit Cuba as badly, because money does move, and it's very difficult. Besides, the limit was not that binding, the limit of $1,000 per quarter on remittances. But the recession in the US affected remittances too. But money does flow. Now, the stop of people going to Cuba because of the closing of the country, of course, affected remittances, because some of them are taken by human beings, for people who are traveling to Cuba. So I think that the expectation is that some of these restrictions will be lifted. This will be of help, particularly after the pandemic recedes, because tourism will not come back to Cuba until that is cleared. So that means in the fall of this year, this will be a help. And but I think the Cubans also must be learning that it makes sense for Cuba to have improved relations with the U.S. I mean, it's no sense in getting into a conflict with the U.S. for ideological causes, for instance. One of them is Venezuela. I mean, Venezuela is, of course, a disaster in terms of policies of all types. And so maybe something will happen there, but I'm not an expert in this thing, so
Right. And one worries about that. And of course, one worries about Venezuela and the old friendships, but one also worries about, as you mentioned, there are some glasnost-ish issues going on in Cuba now, the artists strike and the like. And one wonders whether those kinds of things may make it harder for an otherwise sympathetic Biden administration to be demonstrably sympathetic when there'll be lots of people who will be arguing in the United States that in fact they cannot loosen in the face of what may be a continuing repression of these kinds of social critiques that are now emerging within various sectors in Cuba. So I keep wondering whether things are just so up in the air now that it becomes very difficult to figure out, and there's so many moving parts, to what extent anything there may change, in addition to the pandemic, which has basically put everything on hold, as you suggested, until probably the third quarter of next year.
Yes, I mean, I think that's right. I think that this will be a restraining influence, perhaps, hopefully, and on the Cuban government to allow a greater degree of freedom and opening up. But I mean, I don't really, this is a black box to me, how decisions are made in Cuba and what forces are involved. But yeah, I think it'll be a consideration. And I think the Biden administration is well aware that there has to be some reciprocity in measures, and it has to be something done in Cuba. But as to the economic policy, how it interacts with this, I think that the situation will continue to be severe in Cuba. In other words, the dollar shortages will continue, and scarcity will be a big problem this year. So that I think is a big force for them to begin changing and opening up certain sectors. Although, again, I mean, I'm not predicting anything on this, but one would think that there'll be pressures for them to take more measures. But again, it's a gradual process, as I see it now. Not really, we're not seeing the kind of, I mean, Cuba has been avoiding a transition, and they've said they don't want to really change the system. It's not a mystery. All the ministers are saying we are not going to, Murillo and others have said that we are going to remain a socialist system in the Cuban definition of socialism, which means a state-run economy. But it's already moving, and 1/3 of the economy or so is now a private economy, in the sense that it's not under direct state control. And employment only grows in the private sector in Cuba. There'll be a decline in state employment. I mean, there's been a decline for the last, since 2012, in significant decline of state employment, and it will continue like that because state is not able to essentially have productive employment, and all they're doing is maintaining this huge payroll to avoid having mass unemployment. And but these people don't produce anything, so it cannot be sustained like that.
Okay. So last question, and it goes off on the comments you've just made. Inflation. If everything you say is true, should we not expect, even in the face of these valiant efforts to set prices, should we not expect inflation to kind of seep in through all of the holes that are left in the poorest places that are left in the economy? Do you foresee huge inflationary pressures, or do you think that they can avoid this?
No, I mean, one has to look only at the black market for foodstuffs. And there are quotes around of the prices of basic products that are eggs and sweet potatoes and so forth, that are a multiple of the control price, a high multiple. And now they've increased that now. They've increased the minimum wage by 5.25 times. I mean, here we have to talk about multiples because it's a huge move. But the prices of these things in the black market are higher than that. So no, we will see this, and I mean, they apparently are saying there'll be controls, and what are they going to do? They're going to repress this in a violent manner, putting people in jail and so forth. Well, that certainly would not be a wise idea, and but you can't repress prices when there's scarcity and need. And yes, there's going to be quite a bit of underlying inflation that's going to be reflected in markets. Now, there are supposedly free markets for agricultural products, for many agricultural products, the free market.
Might that be hidden by barter? So I'd always thought that if you have a barter economy, that a lot of the inflationary results can be hidden because there's no way to gauge it. There's no money in the middle of the transaction. I'll give you plumbing services, you give me some fish.
Yeah. No, I'm sure that goes on, but it's a highly inefficient system. And yeah, I mean, there'll be bartering, and then the implicit price of labor will be down. You have to essentially, the implicit wage you get for bartering your hours is going to cost you more hours. But, you know, this, of course, highly inefficient. That's why money was created, so that you have transactions that are fluid and can be done readily on a wide variety of goods. So yeah, I'm sure there is a lot of barter going on. And but yeah, I mean, as long as supply is constrained, we're going to have inflation, and this would be hitting the people in terms of their purchasing power and standard of living.
Okay. All right. Well, this has been marvelous, and you have been an incredibly great sport to let me drag you through a fairly long conversation. But I think I don't want to overextend your kindness in chatting with me. So I think we're going to draw to a close. I was going to ask you any last words.
Well, we live in interesting times, and I think we're going to see adjustments to what's going on, and maybe there'll be surprises. Maybe there'll be surprises that we don't expect, such as more opening and freeing activities. We may see more activities that are allowed to be. Maybe we'll see the changes in the legal system that will allow private producers and businesses to be operating, but I do not know. And this could be one reaction, but we could see the opposite. There'll be ready into more control. Although it's hard to imagine there'll be more controls. And
all right. Well, thank you very, very much, Luis. This was a marvelous interview. I know I had a great time, and I learned a tremendous amount. I really appreciate your willingness to interact with us and to give us the benefit of your knowledge. And hopefully we can have you on again in the not too distant future, where we can reassess how well the monetary policy is actually working. So again, on behalf of the Association for the Study of the Cuban Economy and myself personally, thank you so much for your time and for your thoughts.
Well, thank you, Larry. I appreciate it very much.
All right.